Welcome to Political by Design, where the UK and US show branding isn't just pretty, it's political power. I'm Leslie Pumm, and each episode I sit down with an expert to unpack the moves behind the messaging, from campaign wins to corporate spins. Today, we're digging into how Gen Z votes are won or lost with Angus Abercrombie, chairman of the Greater Boston Young Democrats and a town meeting member in Belmont, Massachusetts. Um, at a very young age, he's mobilizing young votes and influences local policy. And I honestly can't wait to hear more about his story. Ready to crack the design behind democracy's future? Let's dive in. Angus, thank you so much for joining me so early in Political by Design's podcast journey. You were elected to Belmont's town meeting at, I think, 18, is that right?
Exactly. Yeah. So when we look at the town meeting form of government, it's a special fun New England thing where we have, hundreds of local legislators in our small town. I say it's a small town, it's 27,000 people. Um, but, it is an electoral fight every year to see who gets on and who gets to be a part of making the decisions for the town that are part of a legacy that goes back to when Massachusetts was first settled by the United Kingdom, or at the time, the British Empire. Um, and decisions were made by calling the whole town into a hall and working it out. So we harken back to that legacy every about twice, or maybe three times a year, when we call in all of our elected town meeting members. And to run for that position, you just have to be 18. And so I thought, why not? And then I realized that why not was that it would take an awful lot of work, but I wanted to do that work. And so I knocked on over 800 doors. I put in hundreds of dollars to get the yard signs, to print out the flyers, to do all of that work. And I ended up coming first in my precinct and setting a 10-year record for the share of the population that I was able to have support my campaign. So it was a really great experience, and I enjoyed it immensely, especially the winning part. But as an 18-year-old, it really came down to getting out, talking to people, and being able to connect with voters, whether those voters were 18 or whether they were, in their 60s, 70s, even 80s.
I mean, you're absolutely right. And what I find funny, you mentioned earlier, is no one really tells you how much work local government is until you get elected, and then you find out. But what I find really impressive is the fact that at this very young age, you decided to put yourself out there to run for office. So you know, I remember when I was 18, barely any people thought about voting at all. What flipped the switch for you?
I was raised at a time when the United States was going through a very politically uncertain kind of period. I was in elementary school when Obama was reelected. I was actually, you know, Mitt Romney, the Republican nominee at the time, a Belmont resident when he was serving as governor of Massachusetts. So we knew what was going on because it was actually pretty close to home. But that was a much less tumultuous time in the country's politics to 4 years later, in 2016, when I went to bed on election night, being the only person in my house who'd said, he might win. And then I woke up in the morning and I went downstairs and I asked my father who won, and he said Trump, and I said, "Good one, Dad." Um, it wasn't a joke. And the next 4 years showed that it really, really wasn't a joke. For me, watching the impact that that had on, my school district, on my friends, on the families around me meant that I was certainly watching. And then moving into, the pandemic and the Biden administration, I saw what the federal government could do. And one of the biggest things that motivated me to run for office was watching after the American Rescue Plan Act under Joe Biden passed, every single community in the country received millions of dollars in funding to do whatever it took to recover from the pandemic, to recover the local economy, to recover local services, and make sure that people's needs were met. And the people who made the decisions on how to spend that money, those were local elected officials. And I saw some of that money get spent super well, and I saw some of it not so much. And I wanted to make sure that the views of young people and frankly, the values that I hold dear were represented in those conversations. So that's really what motivated me to watch very closely. And I think when you watch your local or your state government very closely, you see things that don't reflect. You often see things that don't reflect your values and things that don't reflect what you think good government looks like. And if you see enough of those, it's hard to motivate yourself not to run because someone's got to step up to replace people who aren't doing a good job. And so that's really what motivated me to step up and be a voice for the values that I hold, that I've learned from being in my community for 20 years now. And that's really where it came from.
And you're not just, decided to put yourself forward and you won, but you won decisively. I think you won your precinct by 544 votes, I think, if I remember correctly. So it's the second highest town-wide. How did you brand yourself to win as a teen in a field of, I think, mostly older candidates?
I think my age was a talking point, but really the way I branded myself was hard work. And that's something that I've talked about a lot when it comes to how Democratic Party candidates can brand themselves. What people want right now, representing them, is someone who's going to fight for them, someone who's going to show up every day, someone who knows what the difference between showing up to work and actually putting in their hours versus showing up and, blowing the whole thing off and doing whatever, knows the difference between those impacts. So I think the reason that I got, more votes than, and I know I got the second most in town, but I'll note that candidate was in a precinct that usually has about 200 more people turn out. And I lost to her by 2. So we'll talk about that one if we need to. But my point being, the way I branded myself was about the work that I did to get there. It was about saying, yes, I'm going to be someone who's in this community and who has the time to hear and work on your problems. I talked to over 200 people at the 800 doors I went to. We went to every single house in the precinct, and including some that didn't have voters. We have a lot of immigrants. We have a lot of people who just don't know that there's a local election and don't know to vote. So we still went to those houses. I still talked to those people, and I said, what can local government do for you? And they had some really interesting ideas and answers. So, I really valued that experience, and I think voters also really valued seeing that, seeing that, someone was willing to step up and work for them. Because at the end of the day, even local government is a lot of hard work, and you need people who don't see it as a place to put their thumb on the scales, but to see it as a place where they can, really, if they put in the time and put in the energy, make things better for everyone.
This is so very well put. And I remember, I think there was an interview you gave some time ago where I think you mentioned the special thing about local government is that you can actually see the people you've just helped. It's about improving things that are so visible. And yeah, you're absolutely right. It's hard work, but I think it's also very rewarding. Um,
Absolutely.
on the policy front, which I think from a European perspective is wild that America is still talking about it. But I was particularly happy to hear about your interest in walkability and zoning reforms. So how is that going in Belmont?
To add some context to this conversation, because frankly, without it, Belmont wouldn't be making the progress that we're making. In Massachusetts, our state industrialized fairly early into the U.S. Industrial Revolution. Samuel Slater brought over the instructions for making the power loom. Y'all call him Slater the Trader, which I deeply enjoyed when I was touring mill towns in the UK a few years ago, because we think of him as the father of the Industrial Revolution. That led to industrialization in places like Lowell, in places like Watertown, which is on the border of Belmont, on our southern border, um, and on pretty much every town with a river. Belmont doesn't have a river, so we never had mills. And when you look at a town like Watertown, I mean, they're kind of turning into a city, but when you look at that kind of community, where they've now put in the biotech buildings, the research buildings, the kind of commercial offices, stores, all of those is in the old mill buildings because they're no longer making textiles. So they've got to do something. And so those conversions have been great for the local economy. Belmont has always thought of itself as a town of homes, and we've pushed back really hard on commercial development for decades. And that's led to a financial situation where we don't have the revenue to sustain the really strong school system, which often ranks top 10, top 20 in the state out of around 200. So we don't have the money to sustain our strong schools. We don't have the money to fix our roads. We don't have money to do all of the things that we want to do because we don't have the commercial development. So anytime we want more money, we have to come back to residents. We have to go back to homeowners, many of whom are seniors on fixed incomes, and say, hey, we're going to jack your taxes. And it's that or we cut services. And there's a third answer to that question, which is we allow for commercial development. And so that is really motivating a lot of the conversation around density in our town. I live about 5 minutes walking from what some call downtown Belmont, Belmont Center. It is frankly, a few storefronts, some of them vacant. And the biggest business we have there is a CVS pharmacy. We briefly had a grocery store there, except it was too expensive and too small of a selection to sustain itself because they had, a postage stamp footprint. So it's really difficult to build up that business environment when you don't allow for added density, when you don't allow those businesses to go beyond one-story buildings. If you can't get up off the ground floor, then where can you put, the offices? You can't put in the larger services, the larger store inventory that it takes to run a successful business. And the rental prices for that commercial real estate get super high because, again, it's just super limited. So one thing that the town is working on right now is creating a new zoning district to cover that area and say, yes, we can build up here. We can build this area out in a way that is respectful of our town's historic character, in a way that is respectful of our neighboring residents, but in a way that also recognizes that when we take an area like that and we allow it to sustain new businesses, that's adding new amenities that are in walking distance of hundreds and hundreds of residents. That's a really key part of it. Because something that I heard time and again when I was knocking on doors, when I was running for town meeting, was that people miss being able to walk to a grocery store. They miss having people who they get their meat from that they know, right? They miss that local personal business that they can walk to, that they can interact with, the coffee shop that knows their order when they go in. That kind of personal touch is something that you miss when you don't have a well-developed commercial center in town. And so that's something that I'm very grateful for the people in planning for bringing up and working on. And, there's a big push against it, but I'm one of the people who tries to get to those meetings and say, this is such a necessary project. Let's keep it moving. Um, in terms of walkability, one of the biggest issues we have with walkability is the fact that, cars are going to move through our town at 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 miles an hour on some roads. We are right next to a highway, and when a car comes down that off ramp and sees, a nice straight municipal road that they can just drive along at whatever speed they were just at on the highway, that's not safe for people on bikes and people walking, especially not seniors, especially not young children. One of the things I did last year, I was driving and I got to an intersection and I was like, there's a no turn on red sign here. But I couldn't see it from the car because it was basically right alongside where I was. And so I sent off an email to our Department of Public Works and they had a new sign in within 2 days. And that's an intersection where that no turn on red sign protects 5 and 6 year old children walking to elementary school. I mean, just a block away from the elementary school. And it's a really high traffic intersection in the morning where it's super important that cars aren't saying, well, I can't see a no turn on red sign because it's in my blind spot. And I can't see the child that isn't as tall as the hood of my car. So I'm going to just make this right turn real quick. And now we have an extra sign at that intersection, which is reminding drivers, hey, maybe wait a second before you run over a child. So those kinds of little safety improvements are something that you can do super quickly and super effectively in local government because it literally just takes someone letting the right person at town hall know what's going on. But the larger improvements that we need to make, we're running into the funding issue. It can cost $3,000, $4,000 to put in a speed bump. And we can't find that in our community development budget, so it's not going to happen in some places where we really need to. At least not yet. And that's why some of that commercial development piece is going to be so crucial for finishing up the walkability. Because when you add foot traffic, it convinces cars to go slower. And it also gives us the budget to put in key protections for pedestrians that they're going to need in order to navigate our roadways safely.
It's funny that, it is, it gives me flashbacks to the many meetings I had to endure really during my time in local government, because the funding issue is, I feel like it doesn't matter if you try to invest in the US or in the UK. I feel local government is starved of funding, and that seems to be sort of the common um, theme almost in both countries. Um, Sort of shifting focus on back on the party.
Yeah.
Now you're leading the Greater Boston Young Democrats.
Yes.
What's the spark there? Why focus on young voters?
I think young voters have the opportunity to bring so much energy to the party. And when they aren't doing that, it can be really hard to win elections. When we look at what happened in November, we saw young voters, especially in that 18 to 22 range, being hard towards Donald Trump. There really are two sub-generations of Gen Z right now in every piece of polling that you see. There are the people who were in high school during the pandemic, and that's my generation, right? That's my people. Those voters lean towards Republicans. I don't know exactly what the cause of that is, and I think you could do some very interesting research there. But the Democratic Party needs to understand that the upcoming generation of young voters is not in their pocket the way millennials were when they were in that age bracket, and the way that, the 22 to 29-year-old voters are currently supporting Democrats in general. That's a really big piece of the puzzle right now for us, is reaching the youngest segment of the voting public and saying, what's going on? Why is this block swinging away from us? And what is it actually going to take to bring them back? It's not just about saying, okay, how can we gear our branding? How can we gear our content towards reaching these voters? It's about being systemic and saying our end goal is for young voters in 2026 in the midterm elections to vote for Democratic candidates en masse. How do we get from where we are now to that point? What does that look like? And I think that's a really crucial question. And I think the reason it's so important is both because young voters are bringing a lot of energy, they bring a lot of skill for reaching their peers, but it's also because they're going to be around for quite a while. And so when we have younger voters in our pocket, they're not going to be younger voters forever. And we can hope that at least some of them remember the work that Democrats did for them when they were growing up, when they're, in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, and they're at the ballot box.
That's interesting. And looking at the data, I've done it earlier before we started talking, and there is a similarity between younger, in particular, younger sort of white males in the UK and the US, and they seem to sway away from progressive forces. They seem to swing significantly towards, in the US, Trump and the Republican Party, in the UK towards Reform UK. Do you have any idea why that is? I mean, there is a lot of chatter about masculinity, but I think I don't know if that's really the answer.
I gotta say that's a part of it. It's not always cool to be a Democrat. And that's something that I noticed being a part of our problem in the US is that it doesn't always feel cool to be a Democrat. But what it is cool to be is someone who's working hard to protect working Americans, to push for their country, to push for their neighbors, their loved ones. And that's what the Democratic Party is all about. It's about seeing the world as more than just uh, yourself. And it's also about looking at, the evidence of how policy works and saying, you know what, this program might make it slightly harder for some people to do business, but what it is going to do is it's going to protect my loved ones. It's probably going to grow our economy over time. So we're going to show up in a few years and be able to have more nice things. Like that's the option that Democrats are presenting voters with. But it's not a quick and it's not a big and it's not a easy to explain solution because it's tackling the system of running a country with all of the nuance that actually takes. When you try to run a country without nuance, you get what the US government is currently doing. Where administrative errors and landing people in foreign, torture prisons, which is a completely wild thing, where, they accidentally turned off Medicaid funding for like an afternoon because they, I don't know, didn't think that was that important, where you can just shut down a field office for Social Security, and if that leads to people not getting their benefits, well, we didn't cut Social Security. They just couldn't reach someone to figure out their benefits, so it's fine. It's all of these pieces of the puzzle that when you try and run a government without nuance, that's what you get. But at the same time, when you try and market governing without nuance, that can be very easily done. And especially for, young people who are often working on something else. They're trying to get into the job market. They're trying to get their education. They're trying to get uh, anywhere in life. They're trying to get to a place where they can, sit down and read a newspaper. But they're not there yet because they're busy getting the economic security and the social security that it takes to be able to sit back and say, okay, I'm going to engage with politics now. And for a lot of young white men who come from, middle class families, they are in a position where if they don't put in the work and they don't get a good education and they don't find a good job, they could end up worse off than their parents. And they see that and they know that. And that's especially true in places like Boston, where we have a skyrocketing cost of housing. Um, so that's a huge piece of it. Those people don't see engaging deeply with politics as something that's really an option for them. And if you don't see it as really an option for you, then you don't put in the work to do it. And we shouldn't expect people to, right? We need to find a way to reach voters in a way that says, in simple terms, this is why we are better for you. This is our vision for what America could be like. We have everything we need to get that done, except for your vote. And I think that's the message moving forward. But when we look at, a country like the UK, Keir Starmer is showing a masterclass in governing with nuance. And the polling is showing a masterclass in what that gets you. When we look at
true, so true.
When we look at a country like Germany, where young voters, and this is really interesting polling data, young voters are split between the far left party and the far right party. Much more so than older voters who are pretty much all voting for the two parties of government for the last however long Germany's had this kind of government. 80 years now. So it's not that young voters are necessarily saying we're far right now. It's that young voters are saying we need a vision that we can understand in the time it takes us to check our phone and then get back to work on making sure we have a place to sleep tomorrow. And I think that is really where parties like the Democrats, parties like Labor, and parties like the SPD need to look to say, how do we turn our message, which, the Democratic Party has done a great job in recent years of appealing to well-educated, 40-plus voters, because those people love long policy documents. Young people don't have time for that. And we can do fun TikTok trends, but those don't show a vision. What we need is to be able to integrate the short form content with our vision for a functional country.
That's an interesting thing, because what I noticed, and I try to stay clear of Twitter or X or however you want to call it as much as possible, because I think it is toxic. I used to love it. I don't love it anymore. But what I notice as a sort of, I don't know if you can call it trend, people seem to replace their own research with sort of just mentioning, tagging Grok and asking, "Oh, could you give me an answer? Could you? Is it true that Trump did this or that?" So and almost going forward, I think progressive forces need to figure out how to feed AI the information, because people don't do research anymore. They ask AI and expect that, whatever AI says must be true.
Yeah. And that's a really interesting thing. I think the way that, specifically things like Google search have evolved over the years from being a place where you punch in a few keywords and you have to be pretty deliberate about how you do it. And then that gets you a list of things, resources that might help you answer whatever your question actually is, to a place where you can punch in a question and it will pop up with an answer to that question and then give you a list of things that are linked to that question. People come with the expectation that they can ask a computer something and it will answer them. And when we have resources like ChatGPT, resources like Grok, Gemini, all of these different AI chat functions, people are really excited about using them for that purpose. But AI doesn't really know how to do good quality research. And there's a lot of work happening to make it better at that. I know every so often I'll see on Twitter someone who is fairly conservative leaning and they tag Grok and they ask one of those questions and they get an answer that is not what they wanted to hear. Um, and I think, you know, AI is progressing in accuracy and in terms of doing that job well. However, I honestly, I don't, I don't know that there's an easy answer to how we deal with um, information becoming that kind of level of distant from the questions people are actually asking. And research being something that people no longer have any time for if they can tell a computer to do it for them. I love getting a question and spending a couple minutes trying to find the right articles and the right papers to explain what the answer actually is. I think that can be a fun exercise. But I was also, someone raised by a mom with a PhD, right? So I was raised right when it comes to doing research on various things, but I wasn't raised in a way that said, actually, sometimes that takes too long, and you just need an answer so that you can get back to doing what you need to be doing in your life. And I think that is again where we're struggling is with voters who care about an election for about as long as they're in the voting booth, and they really need that snappy answer, and AI tools are a great way for them to get it. Um, Thankfully, we don't have a Republican Party chatbot and a Democratic Party chatbot, and everyone's asking their partisan
Yes.
chatbot. But, you know, that's a yet, exactly. And so we could be there in a year when we're talking about midterm elections. And instead of Grok, we'll have a version of Grok that spits out whatever the last Republican candidate for Congress wanted it to. And all of a sudden, we'll have voters who are applying even more credibility to the lies that they're getting from the Trump administration.
Turning to, well, I mean, I suppose we don't really turn to. We keep talking about social media,
Yes.
and in particular Trump's posts or posts sort of
Yeah.
Focusing on Trump or Trump's administration. And what I noticed, there are the sort of funny Trump posts, dance videos, memes. They get millions of views. But I keep asking myself, does that really translate to votes? So I suppose my core question is, what's overblown about this TikTok search?
Yeah. So here's the thing. When it comes to political branding on social media, I think there's this huge piece of it that is young people want to see their politicians like they see their influencers, right? Um, and when you have an influencer who is always doing a deal with a particular makeup brand, that influencer's dancing posts don't lead to more buys for that, more sales for that makeup brand. But when that influencer does those dancing posts and they do their trends, they gain a trusting audience, and then they can say, hey, by the way, I'm partnering with this brand to do makeup, you should go buy it. And that works. I think we see a similar thing in politics where, someone like President Trump will go out and do the trends and the kind of funny posts, and people will, make edits of, him answering questions or whatever it is. And that builds humanization, it builds trust, it builds acceptance, so that then when those people see him say something and that something isn't true, which happens all the time,
24/7. Yeah.
pretty much. I mean, if he's awake, he's lying, and I'd love to see his dreams, but
Really? Really?
or maybe I'd love PolitiFact to see his dreams, but the crucial thing there is that then when he goes out and he says something and it isn't true, people already trust him. They see him as a little bit harmless, a little bit, cool, and they're like, okay, even if they know it's false, but most of the time they don't. I can kind of trust this. I can trust that this guy's doing the right thing and doing the right work to get me what I need. So I'm probably going to trust him on what he's saying, and I am going to trust what he's doing. And that translates into votes. So it's building this very nebulous trust and this very nebulous sense of humanization that I think, Democrats did it pretty well with Kamala Harris. And when we think about the blowout that the UK Labour Party delivered to Rishi Sunak over the summer, versus the overall shift in margin from Biden's 2020 election to Kamala Harris's loss in 2024, a shift in margin of victory there was much smaller in the US, right? Democrats lost a lot less votes than the Tories did. And that is, I think, a sign of how well we actually did in our election, given the global headwinds for incumbents. So Harris's social media strategy of doing the trends and then also throwing out, the odd thing where someone on that account is saying, hey, look at this thing Trump's doing. That's insane. But also you trust us because we just did an edit to a new Charlie XCX song. That worked, right? And Trump is still doing it, and the Democrats aren't doing it nearly as well in the off cycle. So I think we should get back there. When I see those, I saw a Nigel Farage edit, actually, a few months ago. I think it might have been in the lead up to the 2024 election in the UK. And I was like, you know what? I kind of get it. And then I was like, hold on, that's Nigel Farage. No. But just the vibe of nonchalance of this guy is showing up and he's working and he's doing the right thing. And also he's kind of willing to laugh at himself a little bit. And like, I could understand knowing and liking this guy. That is what politicians are really seeking out when it comes to young voters. And it works on Nigel Farage's TikTok. It works on Trump's TikTok. It works, on all of these far-right social media accounts. And then they get to turn around and say, also, the immigrants are eating your pets. Which isn't happening, of course. But if you already trust the guy, yeah, maybe they are.
Funny that you mention Nigel Farage because, I mean, I still struggle pretty much to understand why people like him. I think he is oily. He is slimy. I don't know. I wouldn't touch him in a million years. But it is almost like a phenomena, isn't it? Because those millionaires and billionaires,
yeah,
have a way of saying, look at me. I'm basically here to defend the working class. I'm a working class hero, and you can trust me to deliver change for you, positive change. And then there are actual working class people, like Kamala, like Keir Starmer, and people say, I don't believe you. And it is, it's absolutely like, I mean, do you have any explanation for that? Why are these millionaires and billionaires so successful to claim a sort of a working class hero status for them, but actual politicians who grew up in probably not the best circumstances on earth, no one believed them. So
Yeah.
how is that working?
I think that's a really tough question, and I'll take a stab at it, at least part of it. Um, I think it kind of goes to how people get to where they are. You think about someone like Kamala Harris. Did she grow up working class? Absolutely. Is she now? Nah. Um, but when she was growing up, she was undoubtedly told time and time again, you need to perform like you are someone who deserves to be in this room. You need to show up dressed well. You need to hold back when you want to express emotion. You need to do all of these things to perform being of whatever the acceptable class to show up to that kind of thing is. And that's a really hard amount of training to turn off. And even when you do get there, it still feels a little inauthentic. For someone like Trump, he grew up spoiled rotten, right? Um, he called a loan of $1 million a small loan. What I wouldn't do for a loan of $1 million from my parents. That is not reasonable to expect someone who's been told their whole life, hey, perform being so much or being so, well put together, and having that person go against someone who's been told their whole life, it doesn't really matter what you do because you'll have money anyway. And so Trump gets to show up and say, it doesn't really matter what I do because I'll have money anyway. And then he goes into a McDonald's and he, is serving fries, and everyone sees it as like, oh, you can do that. And for him, like, that's a huge thing. That's a huge, right? Like, that's a huge sign that he is with the working class. He went out in a garbage truck. And
Yeah,
I,
remember
I mean,
that.
I remember making fun of those photos, but at the same time, I think to a lot of people that said, he actually does have some understanding of what it's like. If Kamala Harris did that, it would have been similarly ridiculed as performative. But I think for a lot of working people, she would have gotten out of that garbage truck and she would have had her exact same well rehearsed stump speech. And they would have seen that as another sign that she wasn't true to her working class roots, that she had, I don't know, been corrupted. When really, I mean, she was just learning the same lesson that everyone who grows up working class or middle class, what everyone in that position learns, which is sometimes you have to show yourself as someone who comes from a really strong background, and you have to earn the right to be in the room that you're in. And so when she's seeing that, and when she's, you can't unlearn that for a campaign. You really can't. And I think she struggled with that. But at the same time, that's one of the things that I think made her a great candidate, is that she knew how to recognize the respect that the presidency, the vice presidency, the United States government deserves, and to really put that forward where, Donald Trump doesn't give those institutions an ounce of respect, despite the fact that they made every little bit of wealth that he now has possible.
Before we start talking about the Democrats and sort of how
Yeah.
how we take it forward, I put you on the spot. Give me one word to describe the right ring TikTok strategy.
One word, I'm going to give you: cool. They want to look cool. They really do. And sometimes they do it. They pull it off. They throw on a good track and a good slow motion video, and occasionally they're making fun of themselves a little bit. They're showing that they can laugh, but really what they're trying to do is seem cool and make it cool to be a very right-wing person. And when they pull that off, they pull that off.
Interesting. Um, you've mobilized young voters for Harris Waltz. I think, you know, last August you were pretty active on X and sort of almost like, you know, documented your efforts.
Yeah.
What would you say is the Democratic Party's playbook for Gen Z right now?
I think the Democratic Party as a whole is still looking at the last election with an analytical eye and saying, what can we do better than we did last time? And that's exactly where we should be. And we should be there for probably another year or so. We shouldn't forget what happened in that election. And a big part of why we shouldn't forget that is the ramifications of it. Losing has meant that a lot of people are losing their jobs, that a lot of people are losing the key government programs that keep them afloat. And so we shouldn't take that lightly. It isn't on us when Republicans do something wrong, but we have to acknowledge that when we lose an election, people get hurt. And that's why we need to win elections. So we need to be very intentional about unpacking what happened and rebuilding the next campaign from there. I think the Democratic playbook when it comes to young people is really, at the moment, about saying, how do we make sure that young people can also see being a Democrat as cool? And how do we reach people who have maybe 5 minutes in their day to think about politics? If not 60 seconds. If not, however long it takes them to scroll on TikTok, which, I've seen people, scroll past 20 TikToks in, fewer than that seconds. So the way that we grab people in and we say, we're going to show you our politics and we're going to look cool doing it. And then we're going to let you go on with your day. But for a second, let's see what's going on. I think that is tough. And that playbook is still being rolled out. There are, 535 members of Congress in the Senate and the House of Representatives. And almost half of those people are Democrats. And we're at a point where a lot of them are doing their own thing. And that's not a bad thing. We've got a lot of experimentation going on. A lot of people who are figuring out how to reach the young people in their specific district. Because, frankly, the young people who grew up in my town look a little bit different from the people who grew up, just 6 or 7 miles away in Boston proper. It's a city environment. You've got different demographics. You've got different backgrounds. You've got different experiences. You've got different... Simply the idea of what a high school looks like is different, 2 miles away in a different town. So when it comes to reaching young people, I think we do need to do that experimentation work, and we have to be ready to let the rising stars rise to the top. That's going to be really key, is letting people experiment, and then when those experiments do well, we let those people, those influencers, rise in the party. I'm thinking about people like AOC, who's done a great job communicating with young people and with voters in general on social media. And the Democratic Party should be doing everything they can to get her on the House floor doing good work and get her on, news, on social media doing good work. That's the kind of thing that we need to, as a party, be seeing, is seeing whose strategy is working. Okay, let's replicate it and let's uplift that person. That's it.
You touched on so many things. We talked about, I think, earlier
Yes.
about. You talked about progressive parties having a sort of love-hate relationship with long policy papers.
Yeah. Yeah.
And obviously the Democratic campaign last year was very different. And you touched on Brad Summer, and I have to admit I absolutely loved it. I think it was well executed. I think it was one of the best campaigns I've ever seen. But I still try to figure out on the scale let's say branding is on this side
Yeah.
and policy is on that side, um, where's the sweet spot? So what's driving young voters really to the ballot boxes? Is it all about being cool, or is there a bit of policy in there as well?
You know, the sad truth is that sweet spot is different for every single voter. Everyone has their own sweet spot. For me, it's a little closer to policy, or maybe a lot closer to policy. Um, but I think there's also this really important piece of the puzzle, which is perceived policy. When you look at polling from last cycle, if you take the candidate names off of their policy proposal, voters vastly preferred Kamala Harris's policies. Voters often liked her brand. She was generally more favorably rated than Donald Trump. And that's in polling that had the race as a virtual toss-up, which is about how it shook out. So when we look at where voters are on this, they saw Trump's policies as being, you know, just not one of the options on the ballot. And they saw Kamala Harris's policies being, if that's common sense, it's probably something that Trump wants, because that was Trump's brand. So the branding and the policies are inextricably linked. And I think that leads to this idea that, well, Kamala Harris should have talked more about policy. She talked a lot about policy. She really did. Her social media talked a bit less about policy because, you know, your TikTok that is reading through a 20-page policy paper wasn't going to go viral. And so you don't get to build the trust in the brand. You get maybe 100 people to say, oh, she really knows her stuff. And then what? You know, that's barely any votes. So I think a thing that we really have to end up looking for is, with policy, integrating it into what the brand is. Because if the Democratic brand is healthcare for everyone, well, that's policy. But that can be part of our brand. That's snappy enough to be a branding thing. If our brand is, well, if the Republican brand is mass deportations, which it is, then people who like the idea of mass deportations are going to vote Republican. And people who like voting Republican are going to vote for mass deportations. That happens. That works. So we need to figure out what the Democratic brand is from those policies. Is our brand standing up for working people? Okay, what does that mean? Let's build on that a little bit, and then let's attach those. I'm a Democrat because, one, that's what matters to my local community. That's who's going to fight for us. And two, because the other option is unconscionably bad. But you can't have a brand that is, hey, we're the other guys. I would love to be able to say that I'm a Democrat because I support the party of universal healthcare. I would love to be able to say that I'm a Democrat because of some of these key policy points that 70 to 80% of Democrats support, that the party has not yet taken on. I think that is really where our brand needs to go. It's because our policy stances are so muddy and nuanced, which, again, in effect they should be, but you can be the party of healthcare for everyone without being the party of, we're going to expand the Medicare system by allowing, over the course of 10 years, these people to purchase into the system, and then once we've established this public option form, we will subsidize that system to allow for, like, you don't need to do that in your brand. But you can say, because we've now got this plan, and because the party's on board with it, we're going to do it. And that will result in everyone having healthcare, so that's part of our brand now. That's really one of the issues I see with the Democratic Party, is that Democrat doesn't mean very much. And if Democrat means X, Y, and Z that are good for me and my personal financial situation, they're good for my family, they're good for my friends, they're good for my community, then I get to say that. and everyone else gets to hear that, and it's short, it's snappy, it's effective. Right now, if I have to explain why I'm a Democrat, it could take this whole podcast episode.
Can you give me your take on, because I was surprised to see him there, and I was just paying attention actually because I loved Lady Gaga's performance at Coachella, and then just the other day, Bernie Sanders popped up and addressed people in the desert with, I think, very specific warnings and policy ideas. What's your take on that?
Yeah, people in the desert um, are a bit more of a captive audience than people on TikTok. And so I think that was a really effective move. I want to say he came out to open for Clairo, who's a Massachusetts native. Um,
Oh, really?
so yeah, no, she's got a song called Alewife, which is named after the local train station that's about a mile away from where I am right now. So we love Clairo in this house. But yeah, so I think when you have that kind of audience, when you've got a rally audience, you got to say enough of the kind of branding and the we're cool and we're doing this to get the applause, to get people hyped up, because that's when they're paying attention. Um, but when you've got people in a room or people whose alternative is running off into the desert to escape, um, I I think you have a lot more options to talk about policy, to talk about specifics, to talk about nuance, and people really appreciate that because it gives them something to chew on, it gives them something to think about that, you know, they want to be treated like adults, right? I think we have this problem where we sometimes look to the people who don't have time for politics, and they don't have time for politics. These are people who are working paycheck to paycheck, right? It's the people who are working to make sure that their family has food next week that swung most heavily towards Trump because they didn't have time to watch every single news broadcast about X, Y, and Z that was in Project 2025. So when we talk about reaching those people, we often end up almost treating them like children. And we really shouldn't do that because they deserve respect. We need to respect the fact that they don't have time to deal with this right now because they are caring about putting food on the table next week. And we should also care about putting food on their table next week. Making sure that when someone in their family gets sick, they don't go into medical debt. Making sure that their pension doesn't get taken away or doesn't plummet in value because we made a terrible economic decision. We should care about those things. But it's also really tough to communicate those things to them every single time because, they're busy. But we also can't boil it down to something that makes them feel like we don't respect them and don't respect what's happening in their household. So I think what Bernie went out and did at Coachella was he told people, I respect you enough to say that you're going to understand this. And I know you have the time because you're in the desert at a music festival. So you're not working right now. Don't hit me with that. We're going to have a conversation about the state of our country. And he did that expertly.
All right. How would you rebrand the Democrats for young voters?
I think we're on our way there. I think it really comes down to having young people who are in office. But honestly, if you want to know how I would rebrand the Democratic Party, I think the answer is look at the kind of things that I talk about when I'm on my social media. I think one of the biggest messaging problems that the Democratic Party has is whenever our messaging consultants go on media, they talk about the Democratic Party having a messaging problem rather than talking about all the great work the Democratic Party officers are doing, right? And that our elected officials are doing. Democrats do so much good stuff. And I think if you're getting paid by the party to help us with our messaging issues, you should not take any media opportunity to focus on bashing the party's strategy. Just do a better job. If you think you can do a better job, if you think there are things that we need to change them when you do your own messaging. And that's something that I really try to take on. So I've been pretty careful about criticizing what the Democratic Party is doing right now today because, Not because I don't think that the Democratic Party makes mistakes sometimes, not because I don't think that there are things we could improve on, but because my answer to the question of what can we improve is I'm going to try some stuff. I think you guys should try some stuff. Let's all try some things. We'll experiment. And whichever one of us reaches the most voters, turns the most people out, gets the most people into our column, we're all going to start copying what you did and iterating on that. And we're going to uplift you. I think that's really the attitude that the party needs to take. I don't know exactly what direction we should go in, but I think one of the best directions that we can go in is not being a party that very publicly fights about how to get everything perfectly right, and becoming a party that very publicly fights about doing the job. We want to show up every day focused on what matters to the American people. And what doesn't matter to the American people is how good our messaging is. That flatly, they don't care. And they shouldn't. That's really not an important thing to anyone except people in the party. So we should focus on giving as many people the opportunity to try out their own model of communication. And if it works, either at scale or it just works for reaching a very specific section of the community, then we give them the opportunity to advance that platform. And I think the right wing has done that exceptionally well. And I think Democrats could do with taking a cue there.
Because you've given us a lot today. We talked about the sort of over 800 doors you knocked on. We talked about TikTok. We talked about the right ring strategy, and obviously how what your role is in Belmont and what important work you'll do there. What's one takeaway you hope sticks with listeners?
I think it's a very good time to bring someone from Massachusetts on this podcast, because in less than a week, we're going to be celebrating the 250th anniversary of the battles of Lexington and Concord, when, the brave militiamen kicked out the British Army from a town that neighbors mine, frankly, right? Belmont has a nice long border with the town of Lexington, where the first shots of the American Revolution were fired. And I think that sent a very strong message. If you read the Declaration of Independence, and I highly encourage a lot of Americans to do that, some of the biggest things that were talked about were issues of deportation, of due process of law, of, free trade, right, with the world. That's what the American people were concerned about then, and I think that's what the Democratic Party needs to remember now, is that the American people fought really hard then. And they did so, they took up arms. That's a lot. I'm not going to call for that. But I do think there are a lot of people in the United States who see our current moment as one that needs a fighter. And when Democrats spend a lot of time talking about how, this could be the end of democracy as we know it, how the Trump administration is doing things that are blatantly unconstitutional, the American people expect to see us fight. And so, my takeaway from that is that on the 250th anniversary of the battles of Lexington and Concord on April 19th, I am going to, rededicate myself to fighting against what's going on in DC right now. And I think the rest of the party needs to follow. But, it was the people of Lexington and undoubtedly militiamen who were living in Belmont at that time, who on April 19th, 1775, got out their hunting rifle and went to the town green and said, enough is enough. And I'm not going to get out a hunting rifle, but I am going to get out, the procedural tools that I have in local government. I'm going to get out the protest chants. I'm going to get out the social media platforms that I have. And I'm going to say, enough is enough. Here's how we move forward. And if that turns out to be an effective strategy, I hope the Democratic Party is ready to follow along.
And I really hope your colleagues up and down the country will follow suit. Thank you so much for your time. That has been, I think, a very interesting hour to talk about all the issues. And next time, we're unpacking DEI's branding crisis. So don't miss it. If you're up for it, if you're up for more, subscribe and find me on LinkedIn or Twitter at Leslie Pumm, and give Angus a follow at AngusJBA on Twitter. And let me know, how's Gen Z changing the game where you are. I am Leslie Pumm, and this is Political by Design. See you next time.